So, hello. We're here today to speak with you about the foreclosure crisis, which is now getting much worse again, but the injustice of it reaches back to when it began in 2005 or even earlier. My name's Grace Ross, and I'm from the Mass Alliance Against Predatory Lending. And with me here today is
Zakiya, Alake, and I am a member and organizer with MAPLE, Mass Alliance Against Predatory Lending, specifically our Bring Our Wealth Home campaign, with our tagline, Black and Brown Wealth Matters.
So, first, some overview things. If you are facing foreclosure, do not leave your home. You have rights, and be in touch so that you can exercise them. Number two, if you've been foreclosed in the past, don't give up. Everybody was told it was their fault, that you bought too much house. We now all know it's the fault of the banks, and you have 20 years to fight an illegal foreclosure. And that's what we want to talk about, is the impact especially on communities of color and also women heads of household.
That's right.
Who were foreclosed a disproportionate amount early on, who were taught that it was their fault, and in fact, that was an attack on our communities. And this is our chance to work together to reverse that. I thought maybe you'd want to tell people how you found out about our effort.
It was just one of those things, some people might call it serendipity. I came outside of my house one day and noticed that at a community center there were all these labor union activists that I recognized on my way to a bus stop, I think. And they were getting ready for a voter outreach day. And so I said, well, let me change my schedule and go help. And the second thing I saw was Grace Ross, and I knew her just a little bit, but I trusted her. And so when I asked what she was working on, and she said MAPLE, Mass Alliance Against Predatory Lending, I then monopolized her for like the next 20 minutes because I hadn't told anybody that I had been, I would say, a victim of a predatory lender. I got in bed with the Tony Soprano of mortgage companies, and that was 2001. I'd owned my house about 9 years and had a tremendous amount of work to be done on it.
And before you get into all the details of that, why do you think you hadn't told anybody?
Oh yes, I hadn't told anybody because I took it as a personal fault of my own. I felt very ashamed that I had ruined my chance at the American dream, and that I must have been overreaching, that I didn't deserve to have this nice home fixed up so that it was livable. And I also didn't know that I had rights.
I mean, I think that for me, the most heartbreaking part of this story is that folks like you thought it was so individually your fault.
Yes.
That you didn't speak up and that you didn't feel justified.
No, I had swallowed the whole cock and bull story. Like, this is your individual fault. You made a mistake, and you and your family are going to pay for it. And it wasn't until I ran into you that I realized it's an issue that I can organize my way out of. Not by myself, but we, because when we fight, we win.
Right. Well, so say a little more about that, though, because I think that, when we think about particularly communities of color that were targeted early on for predatory loans, who were disproportionately denied loan modifications, which is when people get out of this mess, it's usually because they get the loan changed. And then, of course, were the sitting ducks for the early foreclosures. Understand, we now have a coalition of over 70 organizations. We're spread all across Massachusetts. Wherever you are listening to this story, you can be in touch with us, and we have resources. But at that point, no one was even talking about what was going on with foreclosures early on. And I think that, this story that it was somehow your individual fault is the very thing we've somehow got to, imagine for the audience, what would happen if communities of color came together? Like, what do you see what changes then?
What changes then is that we then can tell the real story, that we have evidence that's been placed even before the Mass Supreme Judicial Court that says the bank's memos, inter-office memos, where one vice president, I think, says to one of his subordinates, "What the hell is a mud mortgage?" "Oh, a mud mortgage is for mud people who live in mud communities." I'm paraphrasing it, but
or ghetto loans.
Or ghetto loans, they called them. And then I remembered how some of the mortgage company was the one I borrowed from. They've been out of business for a long time. They were actually doing outreach at people's churches. You would see flyers on windshields as you passed by various churches, and they were welcome to speak at some churches and other community institutions because people were having a hard time borrowing money from
Right.
traditional resources.
Right, so the folks were sort of communities of color as finally this generation folks were able to take wealth and potentially put it into a home because folks had fought and gotten rid of redlining. But the flip side of that was that then these predatory mortgage companies, and you say the mortgage company was out of business, you kind of almost like threw that as a side comment. But in fact, you think about it, the mortgage companies that did the worst of this lending came and went in less than 20 years. I mean, what industry comes and goes if they aren't doing something so questionable that no one could keep them in business?
Right.
So that's a big piece of it. And what we've seen, because of course you saw it on the street level where you were in your community, but we saw it in the documents where they actually created kits. They would hire a broker, often, for instance, they would hire one Haitian-speaking broker, one, Portuguese-speaking broker, one Cantonese-speaking broker. They would choose somebody, and then they literally had kits that would tell them to do what you just described. They would say, go to the local religious leader, get them to be the first one to take a mortgage from you, and then use their credibility to sell mortgages. And literally, folks like Wells Fargo put together kits to do this. So the targeting was incredibly intentional. I keep thinking it's the traditional story, right? Somebody wants to figure out how to take advantage of our whole society. Where do they start? They start with vulnerable populations, where those populations are going to have a hard time getting credibility in the mainstream, test out their product, get really good at it, and then take out everybody.
That's right. And what happened though when I came in touch with you, when I got back in touch with you through Maple, was I began to feel more powerful again. I related it to other organizing campaigns that I'd been a part of since the anti-Vietnam War days when I was like 12 years old in the late 60s.
So if you were saying to folks based on that experience, with all the different issues you've worked on, what's going to help them come out from behind their door? What's going to help them think of this as a community-wide issue instead of their individual fault?
Knowing that they're not alone, that those of us who have credibility in our individual communities, like we know we have a city councilor in Boston who has said, you can disclose that I've been foreclosed.
Go ahead.
His name is Tito Jackson, and he's promised to help us continue to organize in the Boston area. And why I'm here today, although I live in Boston, my story should resonate with you no matter where you live, because my story is connected to the organizing effort of Maple and specifically Bring Our Wealth Home. We are a statewide organizing entity, and we can help you. And when we fight, we win. Do you want to talk about some of the wins
I
now?
will. Let me say,
okay.
City Councilor Jackson, I was telling him the same story a little before I told it to you, and he went, oh my God, I'm one of those people, and he also hadn't told anybody. So I really want to reframe this for people. I keep thinking, and it's not necessarily what one wants to think about, but I keep thinking about the lynching that went on for some 50 years in the South, trying to keep people of color from stepping up. Whoever kind of quote got out of their place, and for a long time that was seen as individuals getting killed. And I think that our big problem here is for folks to understand. So in those 4 worst years of the subprime mortgage foreclosures, those were the loans that had been particularly pushed to communities of color, women heads of household, also working class communities in general, and seniors. In those first 4 years, we see literally those 4 years the median wealth of U.S. Latino households lost 66% of their wealth, two-thirds in 4 years. And for African American and Black households, the statistic is 53%, so more than half of the wealth went in 4 years. I don't think we can even conceive of the magnitude of the violence that's being done to whole swaths of our society. And of course, the economic impact is harming everybody except for the very, very wealthiest. And so what we want folks to know the most about is that you can fight back now. We can win in court. If you let someone look at your paperwork, we can often go through and pretty quickly identify some really big violations, not a little violation, a big violation. I mean, can you imagine your foreclosure happens because whoever you took your mortgage from has sold it and sold it and sold it. The party that finally comes to auction your home off doesn't even have the mortgage legally. They don't have any rights at all to your home. And they auction it off in Massachusetts without having to go through a court, so no judge looks at any of the paperwork. And they just foreclose on people. So the only thing that gives them any legitimacy, since they're not going through a court or anything like that, is our own belief that the banks wouldn't lie, the big rich banks wouldn't lie, their agents wouldn't lie, their lawyers wouldn't lie. And it's only our belief in their paperwork, because their paperwork, it turns out, when we look at it, it's no good. So, and I was thinking about somebody who came to me who, again, was very early on with a predatory loan, sold right before the auction. And he said to me, so is it hopeless? Is there nothing I can do even if we could show that something illegal was done? And I said to him, you wouldn't happen to have had an FHA underwritten mortgage? And he said, well, yes, I did. What made you think of that? And I said, because your rights were violated when they didn't help you negotiate a new mortgage before you ever got to the foreclosure point. So again, because FHA mortgages are given to communities that are considered distressed communities, are often given to households who are considered unlikely to get a traditional mortgage, we're again, in terms of communities of color, a very high percentage of FHA underwritten mortgages. The feds have not done a good job of checking that the foreclosure was legal. Instead, they insure these mortgages and go ahead and pay out to the big banks without making sure that what they did was legal. But again, for communities of color, huge and women, head of household, huge percentage FHA underwritten mortgages. So even if you were able, before the property values dropped so much that people are underwater and can't sell, even if you were able to sell, you may still be able to prove that your rights were violated. And when we're talking about bringing home wealth, right? So we keep mentioning, for those of you who are tweeters or Facebookers, we use hashtag Black Brown Wealth Matters to start getting the word out. Please help us do that. The amount of wealth that was taken is in the literally tens of billions of dollars just from Massachusetts homeowners alone.
Can you say that again, please?
Tens of billions of dollars from Massachusetts homeowners alone.
Tens of billions of dollars from Massachusetts homeowners alone.
And we know that the zip codes that were hardest hit with foreclosures are also the ones that are having a hard time bouncing back on jobs, on small businesses, because the money literally left our communities to the biggest banks, either national or international, money that Massachusetts will take a long time to recoup unless we fight.
Because when we fight, we win. I'm glad you brought that point up about the tens of billions. I just was at a conference sponsored by the Dominican Women's Center, I believe it's called, in Boston. But it was, I believe, a statewide conference on gentrification and health outcomes. And one of the presenters, Dr. James Jennings from MIT, he talked about how, and Bob Terrell as well from
Fair Housing Center of Greater Boston,
that so many of the stories in the mainstream news is that some mom and pop comes along and is able to buy my house at auction that I lost, but that's not the case. That what they see in their research is so many people's homes are being bought by these big international investment groups.
Well, even, I think we looked at the statistics 2 years ago, and most of the purchasers were, more than half, and this is a historic anomaly, were cash-only purchasers. So if you think, I mean, in anywhere in the greater Boston area, most of the secondary cities in the state that were hardest hit haven't bounced back yet. But in those really hard hit areas, in the downtown areas in Boston, but in some of like Worcester where I live, and I'm sure to some extent Lowell and Lawrence, these cash only purchasers will buy 3, 5, 6 homes all in one area and hire like a local realtor to manage them, but they're buying them cash only. We're talking about them in a period of 2 or 3 months. They're putting down millions of dollars in cash. So these are the very wealthiest. They're buying up the parts of our communities that had the best shot of being stable, owner-occupied, people of color led, finally, neighborhoods where people could really stabilize and create a future generation the way wealth has always been handed down in our society through your home. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about family impacts.
The family impact. My home was not just a home, it was the corporate headquarters for my family-owned catering business, and before I knew it was illegal, it also was the kitchen for the catering business. Before I found out it was illegal and I stopped so I could get insurance. I got a commercial kitchen through a Unitarian church. And it was also a place where my sons, when they were leaving, let us say, the thuggish, roguish lifestyle and sticking to the values that I taught them, they asked me could their friends every once in a while come and stay with us to get on their feet and learn how to get a regular job and go back to school. All that's gone.
Right. So it was a community center.
It was a community center. One of our members talks about her house was a child care center, and she's an immigrant, and her house was the house that relatives' kids came to go to even medical school in Boston. And when she tells that story, I cry because it's gone.
Yeah.
You know, my first set of grandkids grew up on the weekends with me, Mima's house. That one is 21 years old now with a baby. I want his baby to be able to spend the night with Grandma in our house too. And so when we fight, we win. This is often, for me, it reminds me of in the late 70s, early 80s, when women were beginning to come together with male allies to fight against domestic violence. When the laws, people don't realize how the laws changed mercurically, I want to say, maybe.
Yes,
quickly.
Yeah.
In the late 70s, where voices were finally heard on the issue of domestic violence. Before that, it was isolated. No one talked about it.
It was all your fault.
It was all your fault. And once women activists, probably again pushed by the civil rights movement as well as the anti-war movement, said, no, we're standing up. And the law changed in D.C. and Boston about the same time. We changed it. Yeah. I lived in D.C. at the time. I was just finishing a paralegal program at a law school for radicals called Antioch School of Law. Anyway, we worked with women, and they became radicalized because they talked to each other. They supported each other. They showed up at court for each other, just as we show up for you should you tell us that your auction is coming up or that you have a court date. Exactly. We do our best to show up for you.
Right, yeah, folks don't face this alone.
No, and you can't. You can't. And then we sit, after this taping, we're going to go in a conference room somewhere here or in a local cafe and have a meeting of some of the leaders of our Bring Our Wealth Home campaign. Because we can't do this alone.
That's right. And that's the reason we're doing these shows, is partly so that individuals learn that you can fight, that you can now win, that you have 20 years to fight, and you need to get involved now because we need to do something to preserve your 20 years. A little bump in the road, which we can get you over, but you might have gone and tried, right? You might have tried to fight in court, or you might have spent an enormous amount of money sending in application after application to get a loan modification. What we know now, number one, you're standing on other people's shoulders. So, like changing the laws around domestic violence, we've changed some of the laws. We've certainly changed a lot of the procedures that are being done. But what's more important is that now that we know how to fight and we're together doing it, not alone like you were thinking you were the only person on the planet who got messed with, we can really together turn the tide. So it's going to court, it's backing each other's at auctions, but if you're someone who was foreclosed earlier, all those messages you were told that it was hopeless, that you can't fight City Hall, it's the big banks, they're too big to fail. well, if we really bring this money back, they're going to feel it shaking them at their foundations, because it's literally trillions of dollars across the country. It was illegally taken. I've only seen one or two foreclosures that could even be considered maybe legal, and I've looked at hundreds of people's paperwork. So literally, if you were foreclosed or if you got right up on the edge of foreclosure and sold your home, the chances are good we can prove it was illegal. And for communities of color especially, where so many people are still paying on an overpriced predatory loan, we've got to get to you, because that money's going to get drained out of communities of color for another whatever is left on the 30 or 40 years, 20 more years or something like that. It's going to be impossible for our communities to rebuild.
Without it. As a matter of fact, we've seen studies that talk about jobs alone cannot rebuild the wealth that was lost. Only home ownership can do that. And then here's another myth, that there's something wrong with you if you borrowed money on your home to start a business. I mean, my aunt,
Or send a child to school.
Yeah, send a child to school. I remember one of my relatives saying, "Don't do that." When I first bought the home, don't ever borrow anything for your business on this house. Nobody does that and wins.
Right.
But that's not right.
It's not at all true. In fact, traditionally, up until I think the study that I know of is the early 2000s, 70% of small businesses are started off of the mortgage of the homeowner, so who founded the business. So in fact, part of the reason that we're having such sluggishness in the hardest hit communities around job creation, we all know small businesses are the ones that bring in the new jobs, that create the new jobs. And so there's a real negative feedback loop here. You were doing exactly what people have always done, and it is in fact how we've always survived. And with the job loss, of course, was created by the market crash that the banks created by giving out all these bad loans. And if you ever hear someone say, "Oh, they didn't know, they couldn't have known," we have circulars from the Office of the Thrift and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which are the two big agencies that oversee the banks, from 1999 and 2000, telling the banks that if they kept lending with these invalid underwriting criteria, these really loose, really they just wanted to lend the money, they didn't care if you were ever going to pay it back because they figured they'd foreclose on your house, which is also illegal. They were warned, don't keep doing this. You're going to create a foreclosure crisis. So yeah, we have all the evidence we need, but now it's about you. It's about the folks out there.
That's right.
Go ahead, say what.
Well, the next group of people that we're specifically directing our organizing efforts in the Bring Our Wealth Home campaign is women. Women, single heads of household, were targeted as well. As you've told me over and over again, I don't remember what the numbers are, but when we get women, it's just like in South Africa when they were fighting against apartheid, and they said one of their strongest slogans was, "When you strike the women, you have struck a rock."
Well, so women have to believe in themselves enough to fight back. And I was asking folks, particularly as we focus in communities of color and women heads of household, where's our instinct about just how unjust this is?
That's right. You just asked us that not too long ago, like a week or so ago.
And I think that the problem is that it's only been one generation of women who could own their own homes. We know about redlining communities of color. People don't talk about the fact that up through the 70s even, there were still laws across the country that if you were married, your property was first held by your husband. So it was very hard for women to get loans, and I haven't seen your mortgage to look at it.
Go get it.
But we have looked at any number of mortgages for women that say, right in the mortgage itself, for instance, Zakiya, Alake, a single woman. Now, why would they put that in a lending document? It is clearly irrelevant. The only reason they're putting it in there is because traditionally women were not lent to, and it was sort of a red flag to the lender. Oh, this person might not be reliable on the money. So there was this discriminatory assumption from the beginning, and quite honestly, people think things have gotten better. I still see almost all the mortgages that today are going to single women still say a single woman. If it's a single man, it doesn't say a single man. But the really important thing here is for people to come together. We've got to figure out how to support people not to feel ashamed, to believe that you have rights. You know, the right to own property is right in our Constitution: life, liberty, and property. And it doesn't. There's no asterisk anymore that says if you're a person of color, this doesn't apply to you. And there was never an asterisk for women saying it didn't apply to them. But by tradition, it hasn't. We have to believe that we all have an equal right to our constitutional rights, to the kind of stability and safety and future, I guess, legacy for our children that owning a home has. And it's not property meaning one person gets to own 1 million homes. It means 1 million people each get to own their home. So property, actually, that concept comes from before the American Revolution, the fight for liberation from the king.
Yeah.
And it was that property was considered the means of sustenance.
The means of sustenance. I love that.
Which it was for you.
Yeah,
you literally
it was.
used it to cook.
So many of us. Yeah. You have other people and we held community meetings there. The relative in whose home I live now, she's passed away, but her daughter keeps it up. We organized a gun club there. They started it in the late 70s. I moved to Boston in 1980, and it was in response to the racist attacks on the school children. There was a gun club in the basement. There was a freedom school next door. People used their homes, you know, to sustain the community, not just themselves.
And that's always been true. And that stability, the homes that were owned were also often the place that folks who maybe rented nearby, you know, if there was a danger or a problem, people coalesced in the homes that were owned.
Yes, that's right.
So this is a treasure to all of our communities. And I want to remind folks that one, if you're facing foreclosure, do not leave. Get information. Stay put in Massachusetts. They have no right to evict you until after a foreclosure. They have to take you through court. So make sure to exercise your rights. It's critically important. Second of all, if you've been foreclosed in the past, please be in touch with us. Our information's up on the screen, www.maapl, our initials, .info, I-N-F-O, or you can call and leave us a message anytime at 508-630-1686. Please get involved. But most importantly, this is a call out to the community.
When we fight,
we win. And we need you to help us find your neighbors, reverse that shame, talk up about people now having rights and being able to win. And we want to come, you know, to your church,
That's
to
right.
your synagogue, to your community organization.
Yep. Sorry.
That's all good. Please get involved, because now's our time. Let's reverse this illegality and bring home the money.
That's right.
And what's our hashtag?
Hashtag Black and Brown Wealth Matters.